Do you struggle with insensitivity? Does your wife tell you that you are an insensitive person? Well, if the answer to both of those questions, or just one of them, is yes, then stay tuned because we're going to unpack that. Let's go. You are listening to the Husband Coach's Corner, the podcast designed to teach husbands how to love their wife each and every day and become better men in the process. I'm your host, Chris Scott, and welcome back to another episode. Hey, welcome back to another episode here on the Husband Coach's Corner. Today, we are talking about insensitivity. Now, this is part 3 of a 4-part series of becoming a selfless husband. If you haven't caught the first 2 episodes, then I recommend you put this one on pause, go back and listen to those first 2, and then come back and catch up with this one. Now, if you have, I'll go over a really brief recap of the 4 topics that we're going to be unpacking when we're talking about becoming a more selfless husband. So the first one is obviously immaturity. Second one was what we do with our time or the choices that we make with it. Today, we're talking about insensitivity. And then the last one is stubbornness. So what is insensitivity? Today, what we're going to be unpacking in the definition, or what I'm defining as insensitivity, is not being able to have a sense of feeling for your wife's feelings or emotions, and you don't respond either well or you just don't respond at all. All right. So just to give a scenario, your wife is worked up about something and you stand there with a very straight stone face. You're probably insensitive. And sometimes this happens because you're just not engaged with your wife, which is usually meaning that you're selfish, or you truly just have no idea. You can't even understand what your wife is going through. And that is a whole nother challenge, which we're not necessarily going to unpack today, but that's kind of what I mean when I say you are insensitive towards your wife. What we're going to do is really unpack this just a little bit. And like always, you can shoot me emails, or depending on where you're listening to this, you can leave a comment or a question. You can also go to marriagedrills.com and send me a question through my form or my contact form there. But today, what we're going to do is talk about what does this look like in our marriage. All right. Now, I've already given one example, but what does this really look like in our marriage? So maybe you lack understanding when your wife is overwhelmed. Your wife is moving from one thing to the next thing to the next thing, and she's just getting burnt out. And you're just not picking up on that, right? She's getting overwhelmed, and it's really starting to spill over into the marriage. And maybe you pick up on the fact that she's giving you the cold shoulder on certain things, or she just doesn't have time for you, right? Maybe your wife is overwhelmed, all right? So that's the first indicator that maybe there's something. The next one is lack of understanding of certain things that are important to your wife. Maybe it's important to your wife to have dinner every single night as a family sitting at the table, but you don't want to sit at the table. You have no care in the world to sit at the table and have dinner. You want to either, sit on the couch or go somewhere else, not even have dinner as a family. Like, hey, you guys go eat. Maybe that's a level of insensitivity. You're not picking up on the fact that your wife is sharing something that she finds as a huge value to the relationship and to herself. All right. So maybe that's one of your issues with insensitivity. The next one, lack of noticing behavior changes in your wife. Now, in my example of the overwhelmed wife that gives you the cold shoulder, maybe you are noticing that, but maybe you're not. All right. And if you are not picking up on the behavior changes of your wife, you're probably more selfish than you realize. We should be in tune with our wife's normal behavior. So when things come up or things change or issues come up, we can identify that change in her behavior. And then the last one is actually pretty simple, right? Your wife claims that you're insensitive. Just that simple. So those are the 4 things that you can use to identify if you struggle from insensitivity in your marriage. Now, what do you do if you identify that these 4 things are happening in your marriage? Well, the first thing that you need to do, sit down with your wife and ask her if she thinks you're insensitive. All right. Outside of the last one, if your wife is telling you that you're insensitive, you don't need to sit down and say, hey, do you think I'm insensitive? All right. Don't do that. No need for that, because she's going to say, yes, I just told you. Right. So if you got the second, or if your wife is already telling you, yes, you're insensitive, then just move on to the second thing that you should do, which is have more conversations with your wife about things that get her excited. All right. Now, if you couple this with the topic in episode number 2, which is spending time with your wife, or the choices you make with your time, you take her out to grab a coffee, a tea, or maybe you guys just go on a walk around the block. It doesn't really matter, right? What's important is that you have a conversation with your wife about things that excite her. And excitement happens in a few different ways. All right. It can be happy. It can be sad. It can be mad. It can be things that disgust your wife, right? Coupled with the fascination of learning more things about your wife, or new things about your wife, this is a perfect opportunity for you to really hone in on your sensitivity towards the things that your wife is annoyed with, or overjoyed with, or about, right? So take some time, sit down, and just ask her some questions that get her excited, right? At a minimum, this teaches you how you can hold a conversation where your wife is sharing, and all you have to do is be in receive mode, right? Just hear what she has to say. Ask questions about it. You're going to be engaged when you do that. And then the last thing that you want to do, as soon as you identify that you're struggling from this insensitivity issue in your marriage, is you want to pay attention to your wife. And more specifically, you want to pay attention to the behavior of your wife. Now, this is going to come in a few different categories, right? First, you got to get a baseline of her average behavior. This is what she's doing when she's not upset, how she acts, how she responds to certain things when she's not upset, when she's not happy, when she's not sad, right? Baseline behavior. Second, you want to get a baseline behavior of when she's frustrated. All right. Whatever she does, like, how does she act when she's frustrated? Does she slam doors? Does she scrunch up her face? Does she particularly stop talking? Maybe there's all kinds of things that are a telltale sign that something is frustrating your wife. All right. Figure that out for yours, and then make note of that. And then get a baseline of what she does when she's happy. Does she sing? Does she skip? Does she hum? Is she overjoyed with seeing you? You know, does she give you hugs more often when she's happy? Understand these things, okay? So you want to know the baseline of your wife when she is not happy, sad, or frustrated, right? Just the baseline, like just a normal day, like this is my status quo. And then you want to know the extreme, or when she starts to dip into the frustrated line. And then you also want to know when she dips into the I'm happy line. So now you are equipped with some information, all right? And that's all this is. It's just information. Again, in this category of what you should do first is you got to gather information. Now, I talked about this in my problem solving episode. You want to gather information. Now you're going to take that information and you're going to sit down and you're just going to absorb the information, right? You're going to reflect on it. And here's how you should absorb and reflect the information. Now, do what makes the most sense for you. But I think these will make sense for a majority of the men that listen to this podcast. First, You're going to reflect on this information regularly. Whatever regular is for you, if that's daily, weekly, monthly, whatever works, based off of how far or how much of a problem you're having with this particular issue of insensitivity. Reflect on the information that often, right? Frequent enough that you can actually start to take action, that you understand what's going on. You're noticing the behavior of your wife, because you're not going to see, I mean, you could, but it's highly unlikely that you'll see all three of the behavior changes in your wife to get a good baseline in one day. This usually happens probably over a series of weeks, right? Where you're just gathering this information because you need to confirm that you have a good baseline, right? If you observe her happy one day, well, that's okay. But how do you know that that's how she's going to respond to be happy the next time and the next time and the next time? So you're going to need a series of occurrences to establish that baseline. Probably should have explained that a little bit deeper. If you got questions, just shoot me an email and I'll help you unpack that. You can get my email in the description of wherever you're listening to this podcast, or you can just head over to marriagedrills.com. The next thing, decide what your response is going to be before the situation happens. So before your wife is angry, sad, mad, whatever it is, decide what your response is going to be. Meaning, if your wife is sad and you identify that, you pick up on that, you're like, oh man, something's wrong, she's sad, I'm going to, and then fill in the blank. Maybe that's cook dinner, right? If you identify that your wife is overwhelmed, you say, hey, you know what? I'm going to cook dinner, or I'm going to go buy dinner. If you realize that your wife is sad, figure out whatever her favorite sad thing is. If she just needs a hug, I'm going to go and give my wife a hug. The reason why you want to do this before you're in the situation is so when you're in the situation, you're not trying to figure out, what do I do, right? You want to make the plan before you get into the ring. Think about it, like if you walk into a gym and you're like, you know what, I'm going to work out today, but you've never worked out a day in your life, you have no idea what you're about to do. However, if you take a little bit of time and you say, okay, you know what, I'm going to learn something about the weightlifting regimen I should probably start with. And then when I get into the gym, I'll see if they have the equipment that I researched, right? You walk into the gym with a plan, you're more likely to walk out with the end result that you expected of going into the gym, all right? Same thing holds true when we talk about being responding to our wife's emotion or being more sensitive. We have to know, like, okay, when this happens, this should be my response. This should be my canned response, whatever that is. All right. Make sure that it's appropriate for your wife, because everyone's wife is different. And I would also argue you should have more than one response, because depending on if you are in the house with her when this happens, or if you, like at the time of this recording, I'm miles away from where my wife is. But if there's something that goes down, I know how I'm going to respond, even though I'm not physically present, right? Obviously, my response can't be anything physical that I can provide because I'm not there. That's something you got to think through. How are you going to respond to your wife as soon as you identify that something's going on? All right, this will pay dividends to developing your relationship with your wife so much more than you think. All right, just make sure that you know what you're going to do when something goes down. Know what your response is. Have that plan ready to go. All right. Then the last thing that you want to do, and these are your action steps, is follow up with your wife regularly. I said this in the last episode. You got to ask your wife how you're doing. Ask your wife, hey, You know that I'm trying to improve. How am I doing? And if your wife doesn't know that you're trying to improve, tell her. What do you have to lose? You have absolutely nothing to lose. If you tell your wife, hey, look, I realize that I'm not the best husband that I absolutely could be to you, regardless of where you are in your marriage. If you're 1 year or 18 years or 35 years, whatever, it doesn't matter. If you realize, like, hey, I am not being the best husband that I could be to you, here's what I'm doing to improve, your wife will receive that. Now, I won't, tell you that every wife is going to receive that well. Depends on the history of your relationship. But your wife is going to receive that. And it's up to her on how she's going to respond to that, right? But if you are genuine about your growth in developing as a husband, when you tell her that, that gives you an open invitation to always, or gives her the invitation to give you an assessment, because her opinion is the only one that matters when it comes to our marriage, right? What my wife thinks of me and what I think of my wife, because the only two people that are in my marriage is me and her. That's it. That's it. All right. So you need to make sure that whatever you do, however you do it, it makes sense to your wife. So follow up with her. Ask her, hey, how am I doing? Give me a report card. Now, whatever regular is to you, because, that could be arbitrary speak. That's how often you should follow up with your wife. Doesn't matter what regular is for you. I'm not going to tell you what that is. Whatever regular is, just do that. Say, hey, you know what? Maybe weekly works for you. Every week, someday on the week, say, hey, honey, how am I doing? And see what she says. You'll be surprised. She might come back and tell you something that you didn't even expect to hear, that you can go back and reflect on, right? Because we're going back to that whole gathering information and then redevelop or revising the plan and then taking action. This is a continuous thing. You're not going to one day become more sensitive and then be like, all right, nailed it. Don't have to do that anymore. No, you're going to have to keep doing this, right? Every day is another day to build your relationship and develop yourself. And it's just, you got to keep going. It's a continuous thing. It doesn't stop. Don't let it. And if anyone tells you otherwise, tell them that they're wrong and that they're lying, because they're just gassing you up and telling you something that is so not true. We have to show up for our wife every single day. Doesn't matter what day it is. Doesn't matter how we feel. We got to show up. Now, I already said we're not always going to be our 100% when we show up, but we still got to be there. All right. That's what we're called to do as husbands. That's our role. Because if we don't show up, someone else is going to show up for us. And then that's when you run into problems. So show up for your wife. Sorry, got a little bit on a tangent there. So here's the deal. By reflecting on these three things that you get from your wife, the feedback that you get, and deciding what your canned response is going to be whenever a circumstance or a situation comes up, and then 3, following up with your wife on a regular basis. This is going to be your ticket. This is going to be your ticket to developing into being a more selfless husband, because your sensitivity levels are going to go up. Doesn't matter how good you do at this. If you apply it, you are going to grow, guaranteed, because you're more aware of what's happening in your wife's life and how you're responding to it. With all that said, what I want you to do is find a way to love your wife every day. Peace.